The raindrops on the window of the crumb and kettle tea room weren't just water. They were tiny, transparent travelers from the sky, coming down for a holiday on the glass. I watched them race, betting my last chocolate digestive on the fat one on the left. Get one, of course. Luck has a funny way of finding the things that don't actually need it, like fat raindrops or people who already own 3 different types of umbrellas. My name is Poppy Penhaligon, and I believe that life is essentially a giant bowl of porridge. Sometimes it's lumpy, sometimes it's too salty, and occasionally, if you're very good or very lucky, someone drops a spoonful of golden syrup right in the middle. I was currently waiting for my syrup. Or at least, I was waiting for Mr. Thorne. Mr. Thorne, Alistair, as he told me to call him. Though my tongue always trips over the vowels like a clumsy puppy, is what my Auntie June would call a proper gentleman. He wears coats that look like they cost more than my entire university education. And he smells like old libraries and expensive cedarwood. He is 40, which is practically ancient if you're 22, but he's the sort of ancient that makes you think maybe history wasn't such a boring subject after all. You're staring at the glass again, Poppy, a voice rumbled. It was a deep voice, the kind that feels like a warm woolen jumper on a Tuesday morning. I jumped, nearly knocking my tea over. Alistair was standing there, shaking a very sleek, very black umbrella. He looked impeccable, despite the Somerset drizzle. His hair was silver at the temples, like he'd been dusted with a bit of sophisticated stardust. I wasn't staring, I said, sitting up straight and trying to look like someone who has their life together. I was contemplating the fluid dynamics of precipitation. It's very scientific, very philosophical. He sat down opposite me, his knees nearly touching mine under the cramped wooden table. And what did the precipitation tell you? That it's better to be a raindrop than a puddle, I replied earnestly. Puddles just get stepped on, raindrops get to travel. Although, I suppose the ending is the same for both. Splat. Alistair laughed, a quiet, rich sound that made the back of my neck tingle. You have a very peculiar way of looking at the world. It's quite refreshing. Refreshing is a word people use for cold showers and salads, I pointed out, biting my lip. Am I a salad, Alistair? He paused, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. No, Poppy, I think you might be the golden syrup. My heart did a little somersault, the kind that usually ends in a bruised ego, but today it felt like it landed on a soft cushion. You see, I knew I was being lured into something. My flatmate, Sarah, says that Alistair Thorne is a predatory silver fox who is clearly trapping me with his charms. But if this is a trap, it's a very lovely one. It involves art galleries, long walks through the Royal Crescent, and him explaining the architectural significance of flying buttresses, while I wonder if he's ever eaten a Greg's sausage roll. I brought the books you asked for, he said, placing a heavy, brown paper package on the table. Though I'm not sure why a girl who spends her days painting watercolors of cats needs a 3-volume set on the history of Victorian bridge engineering. I turned a bit pink. The truth was, I didn't care about bridges. I just wanted a reason to see him again. I wanted to hear him talk about spans and rivets, because when he talks about rivets, he looks so passionate that I start to believe rivets are the most important things in the universe. Bridges are symbolic, I declared, waving a teaspoon around. They connect things like people or biscuits and tea. Without a bridge, you're just a lonely island with no snacks. Deep, he remarked. Though his eyes were dancing, I suppose that makes me the engineer. And I'm the one who might accidentally fall off the side because I saw a pretty bird, I admitted. We sat in silence for a moment, the steam from our tea rising in soft curls. It felt like a bubble, a tiny, fragile world where the age gap didn't matter and the fact that I had a hole in my left sock was a secret only I knew. I looked at his hands, large, steady, and clean. My own hands were stained with cerulean blue paint. We were a mismatch, like a tuxedo paired with wellies. "Why do you spend time with me?" I asked suddenly. The question popped out before I could catch it. It was the sort of question that usually ruins a perfectly good atmosphere, like mentioning taxes at a birthday party. Alistair leaned back, his expression softening into something I couldn't quite read. It wasn't the look an uncle gives a niece, it was something heavier, warmer. "Because, Poppy, the world is full of people who are trying very hard to be important. You are the only person I know who is trying very hard to be happy. It's a far more difficult pursuit." "It's not that hard," I whispered, feeling a lump in my throat. "You just have to remember to breathe and occasionally eat cake. Is it that simple?" "Mostly. And you have to find someone who looks at you like you're not a mess, even when you clearly are." He reached across the table, his fingers grazing the back of my hand. The touch was light, but it felt like a bolt of electricity had just decided to take a shortcut through my marrow. "You aren't a mess, Poppy, you're a masterpiece in progress. Perhaps with a few too many paint splatters, but a masterpiece nonetheless." I felt that familiar sting in my eyes, the happy sad feeling that comes when someone sees the version of you that you're usually too scared to show. "I'm just a girl from a small village who thinks the stars are just God's glitter, and he's a man who builds skyscrapers." But in this tea room, with the smell of damp coats and cinnamon, the trap felt less like a cage and more like a home. "I think," I said, my voice a bit wobbly, "that I might be falling into your trap, Mr. Thorne." "Oh," he tilted his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "And what trap would that be?" "The one where you act all sophisticated and wise until I forget that I'm supposed to be a cynical 20-something who doesn't believe in fairy tales." Alistair leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the rest of the room fade into a blur. "Poppy, I'm not setting a trap. I'm just waiting for you to realize that the door was never locked." I took a sip of my tea, which was now lukewarm, but it tasted like the best thing I'd ever had. Outside, the sun was trying to poke through the grey clouds, turning the wet pavement into a mirror. I looked at my reflection in the window, messy hair, bright yellow raincoat, a face full of hope. And next to me, the steady, dark shadow of a man who seemed to want to keep the rain off me forever. Maybe life isn't just a bowl of porridge, maybe it's a series of bridges. And maybe, just maybe, I finally found the one that leads somewhere beautiful. "Do you want to go see the bridge engineering books now?" he asked, standing up and offering me his arm. "Only if we can go via the bakery," I said, slipping my hand into the crook of his elbow. "I think a bridge-themed afternoon requires at least 2 jam donuts." "2, he raised an eyebrow. "1 for each side of the bridge," I explained logically, to keep it balanced. He laughed, that wonderful, deep sound again, and led me out into the rain. And for the first time in my life, I didn't mind getting my shoes wet. Because when you're walking with someone who makes the puddles look like stars, you don't really care where you land. The walk to the bakery was a precarious dance of dodging umbrellas and navigating the uneven cobblestones of Bath. I clung to Alistair's arm, partly because I'm naturally as steady as a jelly on a washing machine, but mostly because I liked the way his coat felt under my fingers, sturdy and reliable. "You know," I said, hopping over a particularly deep puddle that looked like it might be a portal to another dimension, "people think I'm a bit loopy, even my mum. She says I have a head full of feathers." Alistair navigated us around a group of tourists with the grace of a destroyer escorting a very small, very brightly colored tugboat. "Feathers are quite remarkable things, Poppy. They allow birds to fly. Without them, they'd just be very angry lizards." I'd be a very angry lizard, I agreed, nodding vigorously. I'd probably bite people's ankles. But with feathers, I can just drift. Is it annoying, my drifting? He stopped just outside the bakery, the scent of warm yeast and sugar wrapping around us like a hug. He turned to face me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. The rain was drumming a frantic rhythm on his umbrella, creating a private, translucent tent for just the two of us. Poppy, he said, his expression becoming uncharacteristically serious. The world is full of people who are tethered to the ground by lead weights of their own making. Your drifting is the only thing that makes this city feel like it's breathing. Don't ever trade your feathers for lead. I felt my heart swell, becoming too big for my chest. It was a strange, soaring sensation, like I'd swallowed a balloon. You say things like that, and then you wonder why I think you're a philosopher in a fancy suit. I'm just a man who has spent too much time looking at blueprints and not enough time looking at the sky, he replied softly. We went inside, and the warmth hit us like a physical weight. I picked out the biggest jam donuts they had, the ones where the jam is oozing out like a sweet, red wound. Alistair paid, ignoring my half-hearted attempt to find my purse, which was buried somewhere under a mountain of old receipts and spare buttons. As we stepped back out, the rain had slowed to a fine mist. We walked towards the park, the donuts held in paper bags like precious cargo. Tell me something, I said, my mouth already slightly sticky with icing sugar. What's the most Uncle Alistair thing about you? Aside from the fact that you probably know how to do taxes and you own a shoehorn. He chuckled, a dry, humid sound. I suppose it's the fact that I enjoy silence. And that I find your generation's obsession with documenting every meal on a telephone to be utterly baffling. Why photograph a sandwich when you could be experiencing the sandwich? Because if you don't photograph the sandwich, did the sandwich even happen? I countered, it's a tree falling in the forest situation. But I agree, sandwiches should be lived, not curated. We found a bench that was mostly dry, tucked under a sprawling oak tree that was doing its best to act as a natural parasol. We sat in silence for a while, eating our donuts. I got sugar on my nose. I knew I had sugar on my nose because I could see it out of the corner of my eye, but I didn't wipe it off. I wanted to see if he'd tell me. He didn't. Instead, he reached out with a thumb and wiped it away himself. His touch was slow, lingering just a second longer than necessary. My breath hitched. You're a very messy eater, Poppy Penhaligon, he murmured. It's an art form, I whispered back, chaos on a plate. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and the pseudo-philosophical jokes died in my throat. There was a hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with donuts. It was a look of profound, quiet longing, the kind that belongs to a man who has lived a long time without ever truly being seen. I think, he said, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the leaves, that I may have underestimated the danger of this afternoon. The danger? I blinked. Did I get jam on your coat? Oh no, is it seal-lined? I'll pay for the dry cleaning, I promise. I'll sell my paints. He cut me off by taking my hand. His palm was warm, his grip firm, not that kind of danger. The danger of wanting something I have no right to want. I looked at our joined hands, the cerulean blue stains against his clean, pale skin. Who says you have no right? Is there a rule book? Because if there is, I've probably lost it. I lose everything. I once lost a whole casserole. Alistair smiled, but it was a sad, crooked sort of smile. There are conventions. Poppy, I am nearly 2 decades your senior. I have a life built on foundations and logic. You are a summer morning. You should be with someone who can run as fast as you do. I don't want to run, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I've spent my whole life running in circles because I didn't know where I was going. Maybe I just want to sit on a bench with someone who knows how to stay still. I leaned my head on his shoulder. It was a bold move, the kind of move that usually results in me falling off the bench, but this time I stayed put. He was solid. He felt like the history he loved so much, enduring, significant, and deep. "You're very wise for someone who thinks raindrops have holidays," he said, resting his head against mine. "That's the secret," I whispered. "If you stop trying to be serious, the wisdom just kind of leaks in through the cracks, like damp, but nicer." We sat there as the afternoon turned into that soft, bruised purple of an English twilight. The trap Sarah had warned me about didn't feel like a trap at all. It felt like a discovery. It was the realization that maybe I wasn't too much, and he wasn't too old. We were just two different chapters of the same story, finally being read at the same time. As we walked back towards the city lights, the damp Somerset air clinging to our clothes, I realized that the best things in life aren't the ones you planned for. They're the ones that happen when you're busy staring at raindrops or eating messy donuts. "Alistair," I said, as we reached the corner where we usually parted ways. "Yes, Poppy. Can we study the bridge books tomorrow? I think I might need a very long explanation about—" "What did you call them? Flying buttresses?" He smiled, and this time it reached all the way to his eyes, lighting them up like the street lamps flickering to life around us. "I think we can manage that, but Poppy—" "Yes? Bring your own sugar. I think I've had quite enough excitement for one day." I laughed, a bright, bubbly sound that echoed off the stone walls of the old buildings. I watched him walk away, his umbrella tucked under his arm, his stride confident and graceful. He didn't look back, but I knew he was smiling. I turned and started my own walk home, splashing through the puddles on purpose this time. My head was full of feathers, my heart was full of syrup, and for the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel like a giant bowl of lumpy porridge. It felt like a masterpiece, and I couldn't wait to see what color we'd paint it tomorrow. The next morning, the sun decided to make a guest appearance, turning the wet streets of Bath into a glittering landscape of gold and amber. I woke up with a start, my duvet tangled around my legs like a giant cotton squid. For a moment, I forgot why I felt so light, and then it hit me, the memory of Alistair's hand on mine, the smell of cedarwood, and the way he said my name like it was a secret he'd been keeping for years. I jumped out of bed, tripped over my easel, and performed a very undignified pirouette into my wardrobe. Today felt like a yellow day. Yellow for the sun, yellow for the butter on my toast, and yellow for the sheer, ridiculous joy of being alive. I dressed in my favorite oversized lemon jumper and a pair of dungarees that were more paint splatter than denim. As I brushed my hair, a task equivalent to taming a hedge, I looked at the 3-volume set of bridge engineering books on my bedside table. I hadn't opened them yet. To be honest, the diagrams looked terrifyingly like maths, and maths is the only thing that makes my brain want to go on strike. But then I thought of Alistair's voice, explaining the tension and the weight, and suddenly, I wanted to know everything about rivets. I spent the morning at the studio, but my brushes wouldn't behave. I tried to paint a cat, but it ended up looking like a very depressed cloud. I tried to paint a bowl of fruit, but the apples looked like they were plotting a rebellion. My mind was elsewhere, specifically at a small cafe near Pulteney Bridge where I was supposed to meet him at noon. I arrived 20 minutes early, because when I'm excited, my internal clock speeds up like a runaway train. I sat at a table outside, watching the River Avon churn beneath the arches of the bridge. Pulteney Bridge is one of the few bridges in the world with shops built into it. I'd always liked that. It seemed very sensible. Why just cross a river when you could buy a hat or a pork pie at the same time? "You are early," a familiar voice said. I looked up. Alistair was wearing a different coat today, a dark navy one that made his eyes look like the deep sea. He was carrying a small bunch of wildflowers, the kind you find in hedgerows, messy and unpretentious. "I'm not early," I said, beaming. "The world is just late, these are for me." He handed me the flowers, looking slightly sheepish. "I saw them on the way, they reminded me of your feathers. They don't seem to care much for order." I buried my nose in the petals, they smelled of rain and earth and magic. "They're perfect. Thank you, Alistair." We ordered coffee, this time black and strong for him, and something topped with an obscene amount of whipped cream for me. He pulled out a notebook and started sketching a diagram of a suspension bridge, his movements precise and elegant. "Now," he said, his tone shifting into that of a very handsome professor, "the key to a successful bridge is the distribution of weight. If the load is too heavy in one place, the whole structure fails. It requires balance." I watched his hand move across the paper. "Is that like people? If one person cares too much and the other doesn't care enough, does the bridge fall down?" He stopped sketching and looked at me, his gaze intense. "Exactly like that, Poppy, it's about mutual support. The cables hold the deck, but the towers have to be anchored deep in the earth to hold the cables." "I think I'm the deck," I mused, poking a hole in my whipped cream. "I'm the part where all the traffic happens, and the messy bits and the people shouting. And you're the tower, you're the bit that stays still and keeps everything from floating away." Alistair reached across and took my pen, drawing a small, messy heart at the corner of his perfect diagram. "And what if the tower is tired of standing still? What if the tower wants to feel the traffic and the noise? Then the tower should probably have a bite of my whipped cream," I said, offering him a spoonful. He looked at the spoon, then at me, and then, to my utter shock, he leaned forward and took it. A small dab of cream stayed on his lower lip. He didn't seem to notice. He looked younger, less like an architect and more like a man who had just discovered that whipped cream is actually quite delightful. "You're right," he admitted, his voice a bit husky. "It's much better than logic." We spent the afternoon walking along the canal, the water a dull green, reflecting the weeping willows that dipped their branches in like shy swimmers. We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his childhood in the Scottish Highlands, about the cold wines and the grey stone. And I told him about the time I tried to bake a cake for my dog and accidentally set fire to a tea towel. "You are a walking catastrophe," he said, but he said it with such affection that it felt like a compliment. "I prefer unpredictable element," I corrected, "like a rogue wave or a very small earthquake." As we walked, I noticed people looking at us. A tall, distinguished man in a bespoke coat and a girl in yellow dungarees with flowers in her hair. I saw a group of university students whispering and pointing. I felt a sudden pang of doubt. Did I look ridiculous? Was I just a hobby for him? A way to feel young again before he went back to his serious, grey world. I must have gone quiet, because Alistair stopped and turned me to face him. We were standing under a stone bridge, the echoes of the water splashing against the walls. "What is it, Poppy? The feathers have gone a bit flat. Do you ever feel embarrassed?" I asked, looking at my boots being seen with me. "I know I'm not what people expect. I'm not sophisticated, I'm not your age." Alistair sighed, a long, weary sound. He stepped closer, his presence commanding and warm, shielding me from the cool breeze coming off the water. "Poppy, look at me." I looked up, his eyes were fierce. "I have spent 40 years doing exactly what people expected. I have built buildings that are perfectly aligned. I have attended dinners that were perfectly boring. And I have lived a life that was perfectly empty. Then I met a girl who thinks raindrops go on holiday and who paints cats that look like clouds, and for the first time in 40 years. I don't care what the people in the perfect world think. He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek. His skin was slightly rough, masculine and real. I'm not embarrassed, Poppy. I'm terrified. I'm terrified that one day you'll realize that you're a rogue wave and I'm just a man standing on the shore. And you'll sweep out to sea and leave me behind. I felt a tear prick my eye. I'm not going anywhere, Alistair. I like the shore, it's where the best shells are. He leaned down then, and for a moment, the world stopped spinning. The water stopped flowing, the birds stopped singing, and the very air seemed to hold its breath. When his lips met mine, it wasn't like a movie. It wasn't a sudden explosion of fireworks, it was something better. It was a slow, steady warmth. Like coming home after a long walk in the rain and finding the fire already lit. It was the feeling of a bridge finally being finished. The last rivet driven home, the weight perfectly distributed. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine. We were both breathing a little too fast. Well, I whispered, my voice trembling just a bit. That was definitely better than a donut. Alistair laughed, a breathless, happy sound. Considerably better, I think. Does this mean I don't have to read the engineering books anymore? Because volume 3 looks really thick. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my skin. I think we can find other ways to spend our time. Poppy, perhaps you could teach me how to paint a cat that looks like a cloud. It's very difficult, I warned him. It requires a lot of not trying and at least 3 cups of tea. I think I can manage that, he said, taking my hand and lacing his fingers with mine. We walked back towards the city, the sun starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The trap was gone. There was no hunter and no prey, no uncle and no niece. There was just a man and a woman, walking across a bridge they had built together, one silly thought and one serious moment at a time. And as we reached the street where the golden stone of Bath glowed in the fading light, I realized that maybe life isn't a bowl of porridge after all. Maybe it's a painting, and maybe, if you're brave enough to get a little messy, you end up with a masterpiece. Alistair, I said, as we stopped by my front door. Yes, my dear. I think I'm going to paint you tomorrow. But I'm going to give you wings, just so you can keep up with my feathers. He kissed the top of my head, a lingering, sweet gesture. I'd like that, Poppy. I'd like that very much. I watched him walk away, and this time, I knew he'd be back. Because when you find someone who loves your feathers as much as their own foundations, you don't let them go. You just keep building the bridge, one day at a time, until the whole world feels like home. I woke up the next morning, feeling like a crumpet warm, slightly holy, and ready for an excessive amount of butter. The sun was doing that particularly British thing where it pretends it's going to be a glorious summer day before inevitably deciding to drizzle at 2 p.m. It poked through the thin curtains of my flat, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. I used to think dust motes were tiny ghosts of Victorian housemaids, but Alistair told me they were mostly dead skin cells. That's much less romantic, Alistair, I told him. Science usually is, Poppy, he'd replied, though he'd said it with that little twitch at the corner of his mouth that meant he was secretly enjoying my nonsense. I hopped out of bed, my toes curling against the cold floorboards. I had a mission. I had promised to paint him. Not just a regular painting, mind you. Anyone can paint a man in a sharp suit with a jawline that could cut through a stale baguette. I wanted to paint the Alistair that lived behind the blueprints. The one who worried about rogue waves and who looked at me as if I were a puzzle he didn't want to solve because the mystery was too much fun. I dragged my easel into the center of the room, tripping over a stack of sketchbooks and a half-eaten packet of custard creams. My studio, which was also my living room, kitchen, and occasionally my gymnasium, if I felt like doing a single sit-up, smelt of linseed oil and hope. I squeezed out a dollop of cerulean blue and a bit of burnt umber. I wanted his eyes. His eyes weren't just one color. They were like the bottom of a forest pool where the pebbles are smooth and full of secrets. Wings, I muttered to myself, biting the end of my paintbrush. He needs wings, but not swan wings, too graceful. He's an architect, he needs structural wings. I spent 3 hours trying to paint Alistair, with wings made of Victorian ironwork and stained glass. Halfway through, the wings started looking suspiciously like oversized garden shears, and his face looked less like a brooding genius and more like a very disappointed potato. I groaned and threw myself onto my moth-eaten sofa. Painting is hard, I told my cat, Barnaby, who was currently licking his own leg with terrifying intensity. It requires so much thinking. Why can't things just manifest? Why can't the universe just take the picture in my head and go poof? Barnaby stopped licking and stared at me. He had one white ear and one black ear, making him look perpetually confused. You're right, I sighed, I need more tea. Tea is the lubricant of the soul. As the kettle began its high-pitched scream, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Alistair. I have a meeting near Queen Square this afternoon. Would you like to join me for a late lunch? I promise there will be no engineering books involved. Only sandwiches and perhaps a very small, very serious cake. I squealed, a sound that made Barnaby bolt under the sofa. I typed back with thumbs that felt like sausages. Only if the cake is shaped like something. I don't trust square cakes. They're too ambitious. His reply was almost instant. I shall do my best to locate a humble, rounded pastry, pick you up at 1. I spent the next hour in a state of fashion-induced panic. How does one dress for a late lunch with a man who looks like he owns several small islands? I tried on a floral dress, but I looked like a wandering hedgerow. I tried a smart blazer, but I looked like a child playing office. In the end, I settled on my favorite yellow dungarees and a striped top. I pinned a brooch shaped like a tiny gold bicycle to my strap. Identity is important, I told my reflection. And my identity is girl, who might fall over at any moment. When Alistair's silver car pulled up outside my door, the air felt different, thicker, like it was made of syrup. He stepped out, looking effortlessly composed in a charcoal coat. He looked at my yellow dungarees, and for a second, I thought he might sigh. Instead, his eyes softened, and he reached out to touch the little gold bicycle brooch. A bicycle? He asked, his voice low and vibrating right in the center of my chest. It's for momentum, I explained breathlessly. If I stand still for too long, I start thinking about the heat death of the universe. The bicycle reminds me to keep pedaling. He tapped my arm into his woolen sleeve rough and comforting against my skin. Then we shall pedal together, Poppy, although I suspect your speed is significantly higher than mine. We went to a small cafe tucked away in a side street, the kind of place where the floorboards creak and the menus are written in chalk. Alistair ordered a ploughman's lunch with the gravity of a man signing a peace treaty. I ordered a toasty and a hot chocolate that came with a mountain of whipped cream. So, I said, getting a bit of cream on my nose immediately. How was the serious meeting? Did you build any cathedrals? Alistair watched me, a faint smile playing on his lips. He reached across the table with a napkin and gently dabbed the cream off my face. His touch was so deliberate, so careful, it made my heart do a little somersault. No cathedrals today, he said. Just a renovation of an old library. It's a delicate job. You have to respect the bones of the building while making sure the roof doesn't fall on the librarians. I like libraries, I said, nodding sagely. They're very quiet, aren't they? like they're holding their breath so the stories don't escape. Alistair paused, his fork halfway to a piece of cheddar. He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. You have a very strange way of looking at the world, Poppy. It's disarming. Is that bad? I asked, suddenly feeling small. I know I say things that don't make sense to grown-ups. My mum always said I was born with my head in a bird's nest. It's not bad, he said, and he reached out to take my hand. His palm was large and warm, his fingers lacing through mine. It's the most honest thing I've encountered in years, in my world. Everyone says exactly what they think they should say. They use words like synergy and viability and structural integrity. They never talk about stories escaping from libraries. Well, they should, I insisted. If we don't think about the stories, why bother building the library? It's just a box for paper. He laughed then, a real deep laugh that made a couple at the next table look over. A box for paper. I shall have to tell the board of directors that. They'll be horrified. We sat there for a long time, the afternoon light turning the cafe into a golden haze. I told him about the disappointed potato painting, and he told me about a time he accidentally fell into a fountain while trying to impress a client. You in a fountain? I giggled. Did you stay serious? Did you pretend you were just inspecting the plumbing? I tried, he admitted, his eyes twinkling. But it's hard to maintain an air of professional authority when you have a goldfish in your pocket. I would have kept the goldfish, I said. I would have named him Sir Reginald and given him a very small hat. Alistair's grip on my hand tightened slightly. The playfulness in the air shifted, becoming something heavier, something more intimate. Poppy, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I know people talk. I know they see me and they think I'm some sort of predator. Or that you're just a flight of fancy for a man having a midlife crisis. My heart skipped a beat. Is that what they think? It's what they say in the clubs and the boardrooms, he said, his jaw tightening. They don't understand that I'm the one being rescued. They think I've caught you in some sort of trap, but the truth is, I've been wandering in a desert for 20 years. And you're the first drop of rain I felt. I felt that familiar lump in my throat. I wasn't good with big, serious emotions. They felt too large for my body, like trying to fit a double bed into a Mini Cooper. I don't feel trapped, I whispered. I feel like I've finally found someone who doesn't try to clip my feathers, even if they are a bit messy. He stood up then, pulling me with him. He didn't care about the people in the cafe or the perfect world he belonged to. He pulled me into his arms, right there by the counter with the smell of roasted coffee and old wood. He kissed me, and it was even better than the bridge. It was the feeling of every no I'd ever been told being turned into a yes. It was the feeling of a mountain deciding it liked being a cloud. When we stepped outside, the predicted rain had finally arrived. It wasn't a heavy downpour, just a soft, misty gray that turned the bathstone into a darker, richer amber. Oh no, I said, looking up. The sky is crying because we finished our cake. Alistair didn't correct me. He didn't tell me about condensation or atmospheric pressure. He just opened a large, black umbrella and held it over us, pulling me close to his side. Let it cry, he said. We have an umbrella. As we walked through the misty streets, I realized something important. People think a trap is something that shuts you in, something that limits you. But as I leaned into Alistair, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my shoulder, I realized there's another kind of trap. It's the kind where you find a heart that matches your own, and you realize you don't ever want to leave. Alistair, I asked as we reached his car. Yes, Poppy. If I paint you with the goldfish, will you promise not to be cross? Sir Reginald needs to be in the masterpiece. He laughed, a sound that was louder than the rain. I wouldn't have it any other way. We drove back to my flat, the windscreen wipers clicking a rhythmic beat. I looked out at the city, at the ancient buildings and the modern cars, and I felt like I was part of a secret world. A world where architects fell in fountains and girls in yellow dungarees were the most important things in the universe. When he dropped me off, he didn't just leave. He walked me to the door, shielding me from the rain. He kissed me one last time, a lingering promise that tasted of tea and something far more intoxicating. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. "I'll be waiting," I replied. I have to figure out how to paint a very small hat for a fish. I watched his car disappear into the mist, and I didn't feel lonely. I went inside, kicked off my boots, and looked at the painting of the disappointed potato. "Sorry, Alistair," I whispered to the canvas. "You're getting a goldfish, and maybe a bicycle brooch." I sat down on the floor, Barnaby curling up in my lap. I looked at my paints, at the messy, vibrant life I led, and then I thought about Alistair's grey, perfect world. I realized then that I wasn't just a rogue wave hitting his shore. I was the tide, and I was bringing the whole ocean with me. The trap of the great uncle, as I jokingly called it in my head, wasn't a trap at all. It was a bridge, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the heights. I wasn't afraid of falling, because I knew that if I did, there was a man with a steady hand and a very serious heart who would be there to catch me. I picked up my brush, dipped it in a bright, defiant yellow, and started to paint. Because life isn't just a bowl of porridge, and it isn't just a painting, it's a conversation. It's a series of moments where you choose to be brave instead of being perfect. And as the rain drummed a steady, comforting song on my roof, I knew that my masterpiece was only just beginning. I painted late into the night. The structural wings finally started to make sense. They weren't made of iron, they were made of light. And beneath them, Alistair didn't look like an architect or a businessman. He looked like a man who had finally found his way home. The next morning, the sun was back, and so was a delivery at my door, a small, elegant box with a ribbon. Inside was a single, perfectly round pastry from the best bakery in town, and a note written in a precise, elegant hand. "For the girl who likes rounded cakes and stories that escape. I found a library that needs your clouds. Lunch on Thursday." I smiled, a huge, ridiculous grin that probably made me look like a loon. I took a bite of the cake. It tasted like cinnamon and victory. "Barnaby," I said, tossing a tiny crumb to the cat, "I think we're going to need more yellow paint." The world was big and grey and full of people who thought they knew everything. But as I looked at the golden light hitting the bath stone outside my window, I knew they were wrong. They didn't know about the goldfish, they didn't know about the wings, and they certainly didn't know that the greatest trap of all was the one you walked into with your eyes wide open, and your heart even wider. I picked up my phone to reply, but then I stopped. Some things shouldn't be texted. Some things should be painted, or whispered under a bridge, or shared over a cake that refused to be square. I went back to my easel. The potato was gone. In its place was a man who looked like he could hold up the sky, and a girl who was teaching him how to fly. "Thursday," I whispered to the empty room. "Hurry up, we have things to build." As I worked, I thought about the nature of time. People say it flows like a river, but I think it's more like a giant ball of wool that a very confused kitten has played with. It loops and tangles, and sometimes you find yourself back where you started, but with a different perspective. I used to think being grown up meant having all the answers. I thought it meant wearing beige and knowing how to do taxes without crying. But looking at my painting of Alistair, I realized that being grown up is actually much simpler. It's about finding the one person who makes you feel like it's okay to still have questions. It's about finding someone who doesn't mind that your head is in a bird's nest, because they quite like the view from up there. I spent the rest of the day in a blur of color. I painted the goldfish. I gave Sir Reginald a top hat and a very tiny monocle. It was ridiculous. It was absurd. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever created. When Thursday finally arrived, I didn't feel nervous. I felt like a kite on a windy day. I wore my best red beret and a coat that had too many buttons. Alistair was waiting for me outside the library. He was renovating. He was wearing a hard hat, which should have looked silly, but on him, it looked like a crown. He saw me and waved, a gesture that was so simple and yet so full of meaning. "Ready to see the stories?" he asked as I approached. "Ready," I said, taking his hand. We walked into the hollowed-out building, the smell of dust and old paper thick in the air. Scaffolding rose up like a giant spiderweb, and the light filtered through the high windows in long, dusty shafts. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "It will be," Alistair said, "but it needs something. It's too structural. It needs a soul." He turned to me then, his eyes bright with a challenge. "I want you to paint a mural on the ceiling of the children's section. I want cloud cats and flying bicycles and goldfish with monocles. I want the children to look up and feel like anything is possible." I felt the breath leave my lungs. "You want me, but Alistair, I'm just..." I paint disappointed potatoes. He took both of my hands in his gaze steady and unwavering. "No, Poppy, you paint the world as it should be. And that's exactly what this building needs." I looked up at the vast, empty ceiling. It was a blank canvas, larger than anything I'd ever imagined. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. It was perfect. "I'm going to need a lot of tea," I said, my voice wobbling. "I've already ordered a crate," he smiled. And there, in the middle of a half-broken library in the heart of Bath, I realized that the trap had finally snapped shut. But I wasn't the prey. I was the architect of my own joy. And beside me stood the man who had provided the foundation. We stood there for a long time, looking up at the empty space, imagining the stories we were going to tell. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a rogue wave or a feather in the wind. I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. "Alistair." "Yes, my dear. I think Sir Reginald is going to need a friend, maybe a squirrel in a waistcoat." Alistair chuckled, pulling me close as the sound of construction hummed around us. "A squirrel in a waistcoat. I think the library can handle that." We walked out into the sunshine, to people who shouldn't have made sense. But somehow, in the grand, messy architecture of the universe, we were the most structural thing of all. As we headed towards the cafe with the rounded cakes, I looked at the bicycle brooch on my strap. I wasn't just pedaling to stay away from the heat death of the universe anymore. I was pedaling towards a future that was bright, and silly, and spectacularly, wonderfully real. And as for the trap, well, if this was what being caught felt like, I never wanted to be free again. The end of the day saw the sun setting behind the hills of Bath, casting long, purple shadows across the crescents. It was a city of stone, a city of history, a city of rules. But as I walked hand in hand with Alistair, I knew that even in a city of stone, there was room for clouds. And there was definitely room for us. "Poppy," Alistair said as we reached his car, "I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," I teased. "It is. I've been thinking that perhaps we should buy a goldfish. A real one, for the new office." I looked at him, at the serious man who had learned to play. "Only if he gets a very small hat, Alistair. I won't compromise on the hat." "Consider it done," he said, and he kissed me, right there in the middle of the street, under the watchful eyes of 1,000 years of history. And for a moment, I could have sworn the statues in the park were smiling. Or maybe they were just jealous of our feathers. Either way, It was a masterpiece. The following morning, my flat felt different. It was as if the walls had expanded during the night, stretching to accommodate the sheer size of the opportunity Alistair had handed me. Or perhaps it was just that I'd left the window open and the damp Somerset air had made the wallpaper peel slightly more than usual. I sat on my floor, surrounded by half-empty tubes of cadmium yellow and sadness blue, staring at a piece of toast. Toast is a very philosophical food, if you think about it. It's bread that has gone through a trial by fire and come out crunchier, more resilient, and significantly better with butter. I felt a bit like toast today. I had been singed by the prospect of a real, professional commissioner mural in a library, and I was waiting to see if I'd come out golden brown or just a bit burnt around the edges. I picked up my sketchbook. Sir Reginald, the potato of many sorrows, looked back at me from the page. I'd drawn him wearing a tiny snorkel, which felt appropriate for my current state of submergence. "We're going to need more than snorkels for this one, Reg," I whispered. My phone buzzed on the floor, vibrating against a puddle of dried green acrylic. It was a text from Alistair. "The scaffolding is secure. The tea is brewing. The wall is waiting. Don't forget your soul." I blinked. Don't forget your soul. It was the sort of thing a Victorian poet might say right before falling into a consumption-induced faint, but from Alistair, it felt like a structural requirement, like checking the load-bearing beams. He didn't just want a painting, he wanted the essence of nonsense to be baked into the very bricks of the city. I scrambled to my feet, nearly knocking over a jar of murky water. I needed to look professional. Or at least, I needed to look like the kind of person who could be trusted on a ladder. I chose a pair of dungarees that were only 30% paint stain and tied my hair back with a ribbon I'd found in a drawer of things that might be useful one day. As I cycled towards the library, the hills of Bath seemed to watch me with a quiet, honey-colored dignity. I pedaled past the Royal Crescent, wondering if the ghosts of 18th century debutantes were looking out of those tall windows, judging my lack of a corset and my surplus of enthusiasm. I waved at a pigeon. It didn't wave back, but I suspected it was impressed by my speed. Alistair was waiting inside the library, standing amidst a sea of plastic sheeting. He was holding two cardboard cups of tea and looking up at the ceiling as if he were trying to negotiate with the gravity of the room. When he saw me, his face did that wonderful thing where it shifted from serious architect who understands mathematics to man who might secretly believe in fairies. "You're early," he said, handing me a cup. I like that. It suggests a lack of regard for the traditional artistic temperament. I'm only early because I was afraid if I stayed home, I'd accidentally paint my fridge, I admitted, taking a sip. It was perfect. Strong, with just enough milk to make it the color of a confused deer. "So, the ceiling, it's quite high, isn't it?" "It is," Alistair agreed, "but height is just a suggestion. It's merely distance in a vertical direction. If you think about it sideways, it's just a very long walk." I squinted at the ceiling. "If I think about it sideways, I'll fall over." Alistair. He laughed, a low, warm sound that made the hollow room feel significantly more furnished. "I'll hold the ladder, Poppy, or rather, the scaffolding will. And I'll be right here. My office is just through that archway. If you feel the need to scream at a cloud cat, I shall be within earshot." I climbed the first level of the scaffolding. It creaked, I creaked, the universe creaked. But as I reached the top and looked out over the empty space, I felt a strange, bubbling sensation in my chest. It was the feeling of a secret being kept, a story waiting to be whispered onto the plaster. I started with the goldfish, not just any goldfish, but the one Alistair and I had discussed. He needed a monocle, of course, because a fish without a sense of refined vision is just a snack. I used a long-handled brush, my hand trembling slightly as the first stroke of orange met the white surface. "How is he?" Alistair called out from below. "He's a bit grumpy," I shouted back. "I think he's worried about the exchange rate of fish flakes." "Understandable," Alistair's voice floated up. "It's a volatile market." Owls bled into one another. The light moved across the floor, turning the dust motes into tiny, dancing stars. I forgot about the trap. I forgot about the fact that Alistair was a man of substance and I was a girl of glitter and mistakes. I just painted. I painted a bicycle with wings made of library cards. I painted a squirrel in a waistcoat who was reading a book titled How to Find Nuts and Influence People. I was halfway through a cloud that looked suspiciously like a teapot when I felt a presence on the scaffolding. I turned, wiping a streak of cerulean dream across my forehead, to find Alistair standing a few rungs below me. He wasn't looking at the wall, he was looking at me. "You have paint on your nose," he said softly. "It's a stylistic choice," I replied, my heart doing a little somersault. "It helps me see the world in blue." "Poppy," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming that rich, grounded timbre that always made me feel like I was standing on solid rock. "Do you know why I asked you to do this, truly?" I paused, my brush hovering near the teapot cloud. "Because you have a very large wall and you felt sorry for my disappointed potatoes." He shook his head, climbing up the last few steps until he was standing on the narrow platform with me. The space was small. The air between us felt thick, charged with the scent of old paper and new beginnings. "I asked you because I spent 40 years building things that were straight," he said, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind my ear. His fingers were warm against my skin. "I built walls that were plumb and floors that were level. I built a life that was perfectly, miserably symmetrical. And then I met a girl who wears a red beret and sees souls in vegetables." He looked at the mural, then back at me. "You didn't just bring color to this room, Poppy, you brought the air." I was suffocating in my own blueprints, and you're the window I forgot to design. I felt a lump in my throat. It was the kind of sincerity that usually makes me want to crack a joke or run away, but Alistair's gaze was so steady, so honest, that I couldn't move. "I'm not a window, Alistair," I whispered. "I'm more of a slightly cracked skylight. Sometimes it rains through me." "Then I shall buy an umbrella," he said, and he leaned in. The kiss wasn't like the ones in the movies. There were no violins, and I think I might have accidentally got a bit of yellow ochre on his collar. It was better than the movies. It was earthy and real, and tasted faintly of Earl Grey tea. It felt like coming home after a very long walk in a very confusing forest. It felt like the moment the puzzle piece finally clicks into place, even if the puzzle is a picture of a cat wearing a tutu. When we finally pulled apart, Alistair looked a bit dazed. His hair, usually so perfectly coiffed, was slightly ruffled. He looked younger. He looked like he might be about to tell a joke. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "the squirrel, does he have a name?" "Barnaby," I said, my voice a bit shaky. "Barnaby von Nutcracker." "A noble lineage," Alistair nodded. "He'll fit right in." We stood there for a moment, two people on a wooden plank in the middle of a hollowed-out library, surrounded by flying fish and sentient potatoes. It was absurd. It was probably a health and safety nightmare. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever created. Later that evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the library was filled with long, indigo shadows, Alistair took me to a small, tucked-away bistro near the Roman baths. It was the kind of place where the menus are written in chalk and the chairs don't match. "I thought you'd like this," he said as we sat down at a table lit by a single, flickering candle. "It has a certain organized chaos." "It's lovely," I said, feeling a bit shy now that we weren't surrounded by scaffolding. "Alistair, What happens now? I mean, with the mural and with us? He reached across the table and took my hand. His hand was large, his skin slightly rough, but his grip was gentle. The mural will take as long as it takes. As for us, I've spent my life following a schedule, Poppy, but I think, for the first time, I'd like to see what happens if we just let the paint dry. I smiled, a slow, genuine thing that felt like sunshine in my bones. I like that, but I should warn you, I'm very bad at schedules. I once spent 3 days trying to teach a beetle how to dance. Did it work? He asked, his eyes twinkling. No, it turned out he was more of a percussionist. Alistair laughed, and for the first time, I realized that the trap I'd been so worried about, the trap of adulthood, of being serious, of being caught by someone so much more established than me, wasn't a trap at all. It was a safety net. He wasn't trying to change me. He wasn't trying to make my potatoes look like real potatoes. He was just building the frame so that I could be the picture. You know, I said, leaning back as the waiter brought us 2 plates of something that smelled divine. I think I figured out the secret of the universe. Oh, Alistair raised an eyebrow. Do tell. It's all about the gaps, I said, gesturing with my fork. The space between the bricks, the silence between the notes. The bit of the wall where the paint hasn't gone yet. That's where the magic lives. If everything was solid, there'd be no room for us to breathe. Alistair looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. Then, he leaned forward and kissed my hand. To the gaps then, he said softly. We ate our dinner in a state of wonderful, comfortable nonsense. We talked about architecture and artichokes. We talked about the time he accidentally designed a house with no doors. He was very tired, and the time I tried to live entirely on purple food for a week. It was a very short week. As we walked back through the quiet streets of Bath, the air was cool and crisp. The city felt different tonight. It didn't feel like a museum anymore. It felt like a playground. When we reached my door, I turned to him. Alistair. Yes, Poppy. I think the goldfish needs a friend. A very small, very round octopus with a penchant for jazz. Alistair smiled, leaning down to press a final, lingering kiss to my forehead. I'll order the jazz records tomorrow. Sleep well, my little skylight. Good night, my architect, I whispered. I climbed the stairs to my flat, my heart feeling as light as a helium balloon. I went straight to my sketchbook. I didn't draw a disappointed potato. I didn't draw a worried carrot. I drew a man with a hard hat and a heart made of golden bathstone. And beside him, I drew a girl with a red beret, holding a brush that was dripping with stars. The trap had closed, all right, but as I curled up in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Caught in the most wonderful, ridiculous, spectacular design of all. Life wasn't a blueprint, it was a mural. And I couldn't wait to see what we were going to paint tomorrow. The moon hung over the crescents, a giant, silver coin in the pocket of the night. And somewhere in a half-finished library, a squirrel in a waistcoat waited for the morning light to bring him back to life. I closed my eyes, a small, sleepy smile on my face. Maybe, I thought, the squirrel should have a tiny pocket watch too for the jazz sessions. And with that final, silly thought, I drifted off into a dream filled with cloud cats, flying bicycles, and a man who loved me, gaps and all. The morning sun in Bath didn't just rise, it spilled over the honey-colored crescents like warm golden syrup over a giant, stony pancake. I woke up with my hair a bird's nest of inspiration and my heart singing a tune that sounded suspiciously like a jazz-loving octopus tapping on a snare drum. I felt as though I had discovered a secret map to a place that wasn't on any GPS, a place where logic had a tea break and feelings were allowed to run around in their socks. I dressed quickly, choosing my yellowest cardigan because it felt like a hug from a lemon, and hurried toward the library. The streets were busy with people in sensible suits carrying sensible briefcases, and for a moment, I felt a surge of pity for them. They were walking on the pavement, but they weren't noticing the way the shadows of the lime trees looked like lace doilies on the ground. They were missing the gaps I'd told Alistair about. When I arrived at the library, the heavy oak doors were already ajar. I slipped inside, the scent of old paper and fresh plaster greeting me like an old friend. Alistair was there, but he wasn't looking at blueprints. He was standing on the scaffolding, staring at the wall where I had painted the squirrel. "He's missing something," Alistair said without turning around. His voice was deep, a low cello note in the morning quiet. "A pocket watch," I suggested, climbing up to join him. "For his appointments with the acorns." Alistair turned to me, a slow, crooked smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Actually, I was thinking he looked a bit lonely. "He has the library." "Yes, but who does he tell his stories to?" My heart did a little somersault. Alistair Thorne, the man who calculated stress loads and understood the structural integrity of Victorian foundations, was worried about the social life of a fictional squirrel. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. "He needs a lady squirrel," I decided, grabbing a charcoal stick. "One with a very tall hat, to show she's an intellectual." "A squirrel in a fascinator," Alistair mused, leaning back against the railing. "Quite right, it would be scandalous otherwise." We spent the next hour in a bubble of shared creativity. I sketched and he watched, occasionally offering architectural advice, which mostly consisted of him telling me that the squirrel's tail needed more structural fluff to withstand the imaginary wind. It was silly, and it was perfect. "Poppy," he said eventually, his tone shifting into that gentle, serious register that made my toes curl. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the gaps." I paused, my charcoal hovering over a particularly jaunty hat brim. "Oh, was it too much? Sometimes my brain leaks nonsense when I'm eating pasta." "No," he said. Stepping closer, the scaffolding felt very small suddenly. It was the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in a decade. "I've spent my entire career trying to fill the gaps, designing walls to keep the outside out, and floors to keep the inside down. I forgot that the most important part of a building isn't the stone. It's the air that people breathe while they're inside it." He reached out, his thumb brushing a stray smudge of charcoal from my cheek. His touch was electric, a soft buzz that reminded me I was very much alive, and very much falling for a man who was supposed to be my employer. "You're a very strange creature, Poppy Miller," he whispered. "You see the world in a way that makes me realize I've been looking at it through a keyhole all this time." "Well," I said, my voice a bit squeaky because he was very close and he smelled like cedarwood and expensive coffee. "Keyholes are useful, they keep the drafts out. But doors are better, especially doors that lead to secret gardens or kitchens with infinite biscuits." He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that echoed through the empty library. "I don't know about infinite biscuits, but I do know that the board of directors is coming to inspect the progress this afternoon. They expect a classical, understated mural that reflects the dignity of the institution." I looked at my squirrel in a waistcoat and his new lady friend in her towering hat. "Oh, are they going to hate it? Do I need to turn the lady squirrel into a Greek goddess holding a harp?" Alistair looked at the wall, then back at me. "I think," he said, his eyes dancing with a mischievous light I hadn't seen before, "that we should give her a harp anyway, but she should definitely keep the hat. If they want dignity, they can look at the marble columns. If they want a reason to smile, they'll have to look at your wall." "You're going to defend the squirrels?" I asked, feeling a lump in my throat. I'll defend the squirrels to the death, he promised. Or at least, until the next budget meeting. The rest of the morning was a blur of frantic, joyful painting. We worked together well. I painted and Alistair handed me brushes and pretended to understand the difference between burnt sienna and mucky brown. He told me stories about his childhood in the Scottish Highlands, about how he used to build miniature castles out of pebbles and moss, and how he'd once tried to design a bridge for his cat to cross the garden pond. Did the cat use it? I asked, dabbing some highlights onto a painted book spine. The cat looked at the bridge, looked at me, and then walked through the water just to spite me, Alistair sighed. It was my first lesson in the unpredictability of the end user. That's the problem with blueprints, I said, feeling very wise. They don't account for the soul of the inhabitant. You can build a perfect house, but you can't build the way the light hits a bowl of oranges on a Sunday morning. That's something that just happens. The philosophy of oranges, Alistair nodded gravely. I shall add it to my next lecture at the Royal Institute. As the clock ticked toward 3, a nervous energy began to settle in the room. The serious people were coming. I climbed down from the scaffolding, covered in more paint than the wall, and tried to look professional. It was difficult, given that I had a green streak on my nose and my hair was held up by 2 pencils and a paintbrush. Alistair straightened his tie, but his eyes remained on me. Don't look so worried. Poppy, you're the artist, they're just the critics. And critics are just people who wish they could draw squirrels, but were told they had to be accountants instead. The doors opened, and a group of 5 men and women in grey suits filed in. They looked as though they hadn't eaten a biscuit since 1994. They stood in a semicircle, squinting at the mural. The silence was so thick you could have used it as mortar. It's unconventional, one woman said, adjusting her glasses. Is that a squirrel in a waistcoat? It's a literary squirrel, Alistair said, stepping forward. His voice was commanding, the voice of a man who knew exactly how much weight a beam could carry. He represents the pursuit of knowledge. The waistcoat signifies the formality of the setting, while his expression captures the whimsy of discovery. And his companion, she represents the muse. I blinked. I hadn't thought of that. I just thought she looked nice in a hat. The serious people murmured among themselves. They looked at the squirrel, then at the lady squirrel, and then at the tiny, almost invisible jazz-playing octopus I'd tucked into a corner behind a painted ivy leaf. And the cephalopod? A man asked, pointing a trembling finger at the corner. I froze. This was it. They were going to fire me and paint over the whole thing with beige. Alistair didn't miss a beat. The octopus is a metaphor for the multifaceted nature of learning, he said smoothly. The many arms of research, the rhythm of history. It's a bold choice, but one that grounds the entire composition in a modern context. The woman with the glasses nodded slowly. I see, it's quite profound, actually. The many arms of research, yes, I like it. I stared at Alistair. He winked at me, a quick, sharp movement that was entirely at odds with his professional persona. My heart didn't just sing then, it did a full Broadway musical number. Once the suits had left, satisfied that they were patrons of a profound piece of modern art, I practically fell off the bottom step of the ladder. The many arms of research, I giggled, leaning against the wall. Alistair, you're a genius, or a very talented liar. In architecture, they're often the same thing, he joked, coming to stand in front of me. The tension of the inspection had evaporated, leaving behind something warmer and much more dangerous. But I meant what I said. It is profound, because it's you. It's messy and strange, and it doesn't follow any of the rules I spent 20 years learning. And I think I've been waiting for someone to break those rules for a very long time. He reached out and took my hands in his, my paint-stained, Messy hands looked small inside his large, steady ones. "I'm a bit of a disaster, Alistair," I whispered, the pseudo-philosophy falling away to reveal the raw, honest girl underneath. "I lose my keys. I forget to eat anything but toast. And I think the moon is a giant silver coin. I don't fit into a blueprint." "Good," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Blueprints are flat. Poppy, they're two-dimensional. I'm tired of two-dimensional. I want the mess. I want the toast. I want the girl who draws octopuses in the corners of my life." He leaned in, and this time, it wasn't a kiss on the hand or the forehead. It was a kiss that felt like the moment the paint finally dries and the colors pop into life. It was a kiss that tasted like the gaps between the bricks, the places where the magic lives. When we finally pulled apart, I was slightly breathless, and my brain felt like it had been replaced by a jar of fireflies. "So," I said, trying to regain some semblance of my usual nonsense, "does this mean I get a promotion, or do I still have to finish the ivy?" Alistair smiled, resting his forehead against mine. "You definitely have to finish the ivy, but I might be persuaded to help. If you can teach an architect how to hold a brush without trying to measure the bristles." "It's a deal," I said. As the afternoon light faded, casting long, purple shadows across the library floor, we stood there together. Two people who shouldn't have fit, the man of stone and the girl of starlight, finding that in the gaps between our lives, there was a space that was exactly the right shape for both of us. "You know," I said, looking up at the mural, "I think the octopus needs a name." "Reginald," Alistair suggested. "Reginald the researcher." I agreed. Perfect. The trap had finally snapped shut, but as I stood there in Alistair's arms, I realized I hadn't been caught at all. I had been found. And as far as designs go, this one was definitely my best work yet. But as I looked at the dark corners of the library, I couldn't help but feel that even in the most beautiful mural, there's always a little bit of shadow. And tomorrow, we'd have to see what was hiding in the bits we hadn't painted yet. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Library groaned as they swung shut, swallowing the rhythmic click-clack of the inspector's sensible shoes. For a moment, the silence that rushed back into the room was so thick it felt like I was underwater, or perhaps tucked inside a very large, very dusty velvet sock. I stayed perched on my ladder, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped starling, half expecting the serious people to burst back in and demand I hand over my brushes for crimes against beige. I looked down at Alistair. He was still standing in the center of the room, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his charcoal gray trousers. His shoulders, usually as straight as a spirit level, seemed to drop an inch. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, the terrifyingly competent architect looked well. He looked a bit like he'd just eaten a lemon and found it surprisingly delicious. "The many arms of research," I echoed, my voice wobbling between a giggle and a sob. "Alistair, that was the most magnificent load of rubbish I've ever heard in my life. You sounded like a man who eats dictionaries for breakfast and washes them down with the tears of philosophers." He let out a breath, a long, ragged puff of air that seemed to carry away the last of his professional armor. "I have spent 20 years convincing people that buildings are made of stone and logic. Poppy, it turns out, when faced with an octopus playing a saxophone in a 19th century mural, one must pivot to the profound or face a very awkward insurance claim." I scrambled down the ladder, my movements as graceful as a baby giraffe on roller skates. I tripped on the bottom rung, but Alistair was there, his hands catching my elbows to steady me. The touch was electric. The sort of spark you get when you rub your feet on a carpet and touch a doorknob, only instead of a mild annoyance, it felt like my entire soul was being plugged into a very cheerful toaster. "You saved Reginald," I whispered, looking up at him. "They would have painted over him. They would have turned my jazz-loving cephalopod into a boring old shelf of books." I suspect Reginald is much better at his job than a shelf of books, Alistair said, his voice dropping to that low, gravelly hum that made my knees feel like they were made of overboiled cabbage. He didn't let go of my arms. Instead, his grip shifted, his thumbs tracing small, gentle circles against my skin. And besides, the library was too quiet. It needed a bit of rhythm. It needed you. I felt my face heat up. I've always been a bit like a kettle. I start to whistle when things get too hot. And right now, I was practically screaming. To distract myself, I leaned my head against his chest. He smelled of expensive cedarwood, old vellum, and just a hint of the Earl Grey tea he'd been drinking all afternoon. It was the smell of a man who knew exactly where his socks were at all times, which was a very comforting thing to a girl who currently had one blue sock and one green sock on, and couldn't remember where she'd left her shoes. I'm not a very sensible person, Alistair, I muttered into his waistcoat. My brain is mostly made of glitter and half-remembered nursery rhymes. I think that if you smile at a sunflower for long enough, it might tell you a secret. I'm a disaster in a world of blueprints. Alistair tilted my chin up so I had to look at him. His eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were soft, like the edges of a charcoal sketch. Blueprints are just dreams with measurements, Poppy, but they're hollow, they're just skeletons. You're the one who puts the skin on the bones, you're the one who gives them a heart. I've spent my life building boxes for people to live in, but I forgot that people actually have to live in them. They need the mess, they need the octopuses. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His fingers were stained with a tiny smudge of midnight blue from where he'd brushed against the wall earlier. It felt like a badge of honor. I've spent a long time being a very serious man in a very serious suit, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. But when I saw you sitting on that ladder, arguing with a squirrel about the color of its hat, I realized I was terribly bored. I don't want to be bored anymore. Poppy, I want the toast, I want the silver coin moon. I want the girl who sees magic in the gaps between the bricks. And then, he kissed me. It wasn't a blueprint of a kiss, it wasn't planned or measured or checked for structural integrity. It was a messy, wonderful, paint-smudged collision of two worlds that had no business meeting. It felt like the moment the sun finally breaks through a week of British rain, sudden, warm, and making everything look 1,000 times brighter. My heart did a little somersault, tripped over itself, and then settled into a rhythm that matched his. When we finally broke apart, the library seemed different. The shadows weren't just dark corners anymore. They were places where stories were waiting to be written. The air felt charged, as if the books on the shelves were all whispering to each other about the scandal they'd just witnessed. So I said, trying to find my voice, which had apparently decided to go on holiday to the seaside. Does this mean the project is officially finished? Do I get my final check and a polite handshake? Alistair laughed, a rich, warm sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Absolutely not. The ivy is only half done. And I suspect Reginald needs a band. An octopus can't play jazz alone, surely. I beamed at him. He needs a crab on the drums. And maybe a very small seahorse on the flute. Then you'd better get back to work, he said, though he didn't move away. He stayed right there, in the circle of my space, looking at me as if I were the most complicated and beautiful structure he'd ever encountered. But perhaps, after the seahorse is finished, you might allow me to take you to dinner, somewhere with very few blueprints and a great deal of dessert. Only if there's cake, I said firmly. I find that most of life's problems can be solved by a very large slice of Victoria sponge. It's the glue that holds the universe together. Really, if we didn't have cake, the stars would probably just fall out of the sky from sheer exhaustion. Alistair nodded solemnly. though his eyes were dancing. I shall make it my mission to ensure the stars remain firmly in place then. He picked up a brush, a small, fine-tipped one, and held it out to me like a scepter. As I took it, our fingers brushed again, and that little spark of magic flared up once more. I climbed back up my ladder, feeling lighter than air, as if the gravity of the serious world no longer applied to me. As the sun began to set, casting long, honey-colored ribbons across the floor, we worked together. He didn't actually paint much. He was much better at holding the palette and telling me when I was about to dip my brush into his tea, but he was there. And that was the thing about the trap I'd thought I was in. I'd spent so much time worrying about being caught, about being forced to fit into a shape that wasn't mine, that I hadn't realized Alistair wasn't trying to change me at all. He was just building a frame around the picture I was already painting. "You know," I said, pausing with a dollop of emerald green on my brush, "I think the shadow in the corner over there, the one behind the poetry section, it looks a bit like a dragon's tail." Alistair looked at the dark corner, then back at me. A few months ago, he would have pointed out that it was merely an architectural anomaly caused by the intersection of the south wall and the buttress. Instead, he smiled. "A dragon, you say? Well, I suppose every library needs a guardian. Does he have a name?" "Barnaby," I decided. "Barnaby the Brave. He protects the sonnets from the dust bunnies." "Perfect," Alistair said, leaning back against the mahogany desk. "We'll start on Barnaby tomorrow." I looked out of the high window at the darkening sky. The moon was rising, a pale, shimmering disk that did, indeed, look exactly like a silver coin dropped by a giant. Life was strange and messy, and full of octopuses in places they didn't belong. But as I looked down at the man waiting for me at the bottom of the ladder, I realized that the best parts of the mural weren't the bits I planned. They were the bits that happened when the paint ran, when the brush slipped, and when I stopped trying to be perfect and started being found. The trap hadn't snapped shut on me. It had opened up, revealing a whole new world where I could be a disaster and a masterpiece all at once. And as far as designs go, I think even a master architect would have to agree. It was absolutely, profoundly, marvelously spot on.